What's up, folks? This is Mr. Chitwood back again. We're going to be talking about, in this video lecture series, we're going to be wrapping it up, talking about Napoleon and the end of the French Revolution. And we're also going to be talking about a couple other revolutions that happened around the world, and just for comparison purposes, so that we have an understanding of not only what's happening in Europe during this time period, but what might also be happening in Latin and South America during this time period as well. So we're going to continue on where we were at before, talking about the French Revolution. We left off talking about the Estates General and the formation of the National Assembly. And in the meantime, we've kind of discussed other things such as the Declaration of Rights of Man, and also how that has been influenced by Enlightenment thinkers, just as we had discussed with the Declaration of Independence earlier as well. I will remind you guys just briefly about your essential question for this specific lesson. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to be trying to figure out what exactly it was that were the after effects from the French Revolution, and how this guy Napoleon rose to power. So I'll give you a second to jot that down. So Robespierre was somebody that we had mentioned towards the tail end of the video lecture from the part one of this series. We had mentioned him as kind of the first person to come to power in terms of the large-scale revolution that occurred within France, and the overthrow of the societal dynamics that had happened. And with Robespierre, it begins a time period called the Reign of Terror, where you see mass executions of the enemies of the revolution, in which you primarily see the usage of the guillotine, that is the sharp blade that kind of drops down on somebody's head and then cuts it off into a basket. Robespierre was a harsh punisher of people that did not prescribe to what the revolution was trying to accomplish. So while he was an advocate for the poor and for democratic institutions to arise in France, he also was kind of like this tyrannical leader at the same sense, where he was trying to either say, you either get with our way or you get sent to the guillotine and your life gets ended. So Robespierre kind of becomes this authoritarian figure within society immediately following the upheaval of the French Revolution, and ultimately leads to this creation of what was called the Committee of Public Safety. And it was headed by Georges Danton, and it was designed to suppress opposition both inside and outside of France. So it's another step, another layer in terms of trying to create and foster support for the ideas of the revolution. And ultimately, this Committee of Public Safety calls for the execution of King Louis, ultimately sending him to the guillotine. So in turn, let's kind of check out what's going to happen with the revolution from, I guess, a broader range. The people turn against Robespierre's reign of terror. The Directory becomes the new established government within France. And ultimately, people lose confidence in their government, even though they had thrown off one government and instituted another one. They generally did not really come out of the revolution with a hard and fast government like the United States would eventually have later on. It was more kind of fluid, in which the people of France kind of just replaced one bad government with another one. And that's kind of where Napoleon enters the scene. He's often heralded as a military genius. He stages a coup d'etat, which is kind of like an uprising, or you might have heard a coup before, which is kind of like an overthrow of a certain government. So Napoleon overthrows the current government in 1799 and names himself the first consul, or basically the leader of France at this time period. And a plebiscite, which is a fancy word for a vote by the people, approved his role. So Napoleon just kind of rose to power and happened to be a victim of circumstance at the right place at the right time, to actually ascend in power throughout the French political system. He has a bunch of military feats that he's largely known for. He invaded and attempted to colonize Egypt. He is also known for conquering Austria, Prussia, Portugal, and Spain. And this picture right here is actually pretty interesting because it shows him as this like glorious figure riding this horse, and he's this very glorious figure that should be kind of remarked as a heroic person. And while there may be cases to be made on both sides, largely what this picture that we see here of Napoleon is almost like the beginning stages of what we will eventually start to talk about in this class, that is propaganda. What we see here in this picture is Napoleon's really trying to portray himself as this very powerful and authoritative figure, riding this horse, marching into battle, and being all those things that the people want in a leader, that is somebody that's going to stand up for them and do all of those right things. But really, if we took Napoleon off of this horse, he's actually quite a very short person. He would not have this very heroic stature. So he kind of creates this persona that can be portrayed to the people to persuade them into believing in him and also into following him into the various endeavors that he takes the country. And around 1812, he attempts to unify Europe under French rule. So basically, he's trying to take rule from France and extend it to most other places throughout Europe. He's trying to basically create a French empire through the use of what is called the continental system. And ultimately, he tried to do this to isolate and weaken British control within the region. So all the areas that you see on this map in the bottom right-hand corner indicate regions of British control. He figured that if he could kind of take control of the immediate surrounding area around the island of Great Britain, that he could, through the use of this continental system and taking over all of these other regions, he could ultimately suffocate what was once or would be considered the power in the region, and ultimately kind of suffocate them into submission under French control. But we will see that does not necessarily happen, because through political change, Napoleon is going to institute Napoleonic Code, which is basically a simplification of laws for France. And on its face, this was generally a decent thing. It was eliminating the estate system within France. It no longer categorized people in society as the first, second, and third estate. More or less, people were kind of being portrayed or classified as just French people or French citizens, instead of being members of the first, second, or third estate, this kind of hierarchical kind of social construct of who's better and who's not. And it also allowed for a lot of religious freedom. But what we're going to see is, as he's starting to gain more and more influence, more and more power, he's going to crown himself Emperor of France in 1804 and embody this new persona. As you can see from this picture on the left, is a lot different than the picture that he had originally started to portray himself as this military leader, this general that was willing to fight for the people. Now it almost seems like he's kind of trying to embody this persona as this king that people should be bowing down to and really respecting in terms of his status in France. And ultimately, as we see here, another picture kind of indicating this not only societal status, but this high religious status, as well as you're seeing some sort of religious ceremony that is kind of crowning him as this emperor in the region. And it is with this, the beginning of the 19th century, that we're going to see Napoleon's ultimate downfall, as he's going to do something that we will talk about throughout this class many times as the one thing you don't want to do, that is to invade Russia, specifically in the winter. But Napoleon decides to invade Russia in 1812 and ultimately becomes a disaster due to many different reasons, but the French military was drastically unprepared for the winter conditions and was undersupplied. French forces ultimately retreated following their attempted invasion of Moscow and Russia, and basically allowed other countries to capitalize on the crippled French army once they returned or while they were gone. So ultimately, through the use of this continental system that Napoleon was trying to create or use to take over and create an empire for France and Europe, ultimately indicated a downfall for France and Napoleon, as he basically exposed France to any other country that was willing to attack them or to take advantage of these weaknesses. In addition to the invasion of Russia, there was a coalition of European powers that ultimately defeated him and exiled him to the island of Elba. And he escapes for roughly 100 days and was defeated again at the Battle of Waterloo after his attempt to regain control in the area. But what we're going to see here is that we start to see the boundaries of what we start to know as today modern day Europe start to kind of take place and shift away from Napoleon's once empire into these kind of modern day present boundaries, which is again going to create another reason why we're going to have to understand why these boundaries of Europe are being changed with these specific countries. You're going to see that France is obviously right here in green. You have French allies in purple and French enemies in yellow, but this is much different than it looked before at the beginning of Napoleon's continental system, which ultimately leads, after the downfall of Napoleon, the necessity for some sort of structure within Europe to basically create balance. And what we're going to see to create this balance is this thing called the Congress of Vienna, ultimately led by Prince Metternich, which is trying to create some sort of a balance between countries so that one country is not trying to create this vast European empire that is only controlled by one set of people or one country, which we will start to see as we get into the World War I and World War II, that this starts to become somewhat of a problem. We also see that through the Congress of Vienna, it restores the monarchies that were in power prior to the French Revolution. So it's almost like once we get to the Congress of Vienna, the French Revolution hadn't really accomplished all too much. And in addition to that, the boundaries of Europe are redrawn. So ultimately, after the Congress of Vienna, this is what we're going to see Europe look like. The boundaries are starting to look more modern. You start to see these more modern countries come about, and these boundaries start to look like what we know today as modern day Europe, but there will be some changes from here on out. Having said that, now I would like to kind of switch into a different region of the world just for comparison purposes, so that we're taking what we understand from the French Revolution and the American Revolution and what we know as modern day United States, to talk about Latin American independence movements, and primarily focusing on Simón Bolívar. So to understand the independence movements within Latin and South America, we need to understand the colonial system that was taking place there, just as the colonial system in North America had been taking place for Great Britain. Cities basically become outposts of control for European countries such as Spain and France. Catholicism is the major religion within the area. Colonies often mirror their mother countries, so you have Spanish colonies start to look a lot like the Spanish government. French colonies look a lot like French government. British colonies look a lot like British government. Wealth is often gained through mining precious metals in the region, so the extraction of resources from these regions. And there was also this thing called the viceroyalty system, where you had royal officials appointed from leaders in Europe that were dictating how things are operating within these colonies. So let's talk about Haiti, for example. There's a slave rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. he basically was able to lead a revolution that defeats France and Napoleon's armies within the region, and ultimately abolishes slavery in Haiti, which is the first nation to do so within the larger Americas region. In Mexico, we have independence movements were led by Father Miguel Hidalgo, and we also have this figure that is by the name of Simon Bolivar, who was inspired by Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, and Voltaire, and Rousseau, that focus on liberating northern Latin America from Spanish rule. He was a native-born Creole from Venezuela, and overturns through his process of these independence movements the rigid class system that is the peninsulares, the Creoles, and the mestizos. And in response to all of these Latin American independence movements, we have the Monroe Doctrine that is issued in 1823 by U.S. President James Monroe, that says Latin America must remain independent, that Latin American countries should be able to kind of govern themselves, and that Europeans interfering in Latin America is a threat to America's peace and safety. And while at the whole it seems like, oh, James Monroe, pretty rad guy. He seems to have an understanding of like people should be able to rule themselves, right? On one hand, yes, but on the other hand, you can look at this from the United States point of view. They would much rather have Latin American countries trying to take care of themselves rather than have any European influence closer in terms of geography speaking, having these European countries that are closer by that are able to kind of wage either wars or some sort of have influence in the region that is closer to the United States. So to give you a brief overview, what we just kind of looked at in terms of comparison, you have the independence movement in Mexico that is led by Miguel Hidalgo that lasted roughly between 1810 and 1821. You have Simon Bolivar in Venezuela that it was largely inspired by the Enlightenment and liberated northern Latin America, and ultimately overturns this rigid class system. And then you also have this idea that in Haiti, we have a slave rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture that defeats France, Spain, and England, and ultimately abolishes slavery in Haiti, and would ultimately serve as a spark for the abolishment of slavery in other regions throughout the Americas. So, having said that, I hope that having this kind of comparison and understanding of revolutions throughout other places throughout the world helps kind of indicate to you what this idea of a revolution means for not only places within Europe, but also places within North America and Latin America as well, and how specifically Enlightenment thinkers brought about change, brought about new ideas to influence these revolutions to occur and to ultimately lead to action that would throw off the balance of power that is these large-scale elites, and placing the power from those large-scale elites into the hands of the people. So with that, this video lecture series is going to come to a close. If you would like to review some of this material, now would be a great time to click on some of those links that I've put up here in front of you, to links to other video lectures, obviously to subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more about the history of the world during this time period. And with that, we'll pick this up when we get to the Industrial Revolution.